to the Bronx Journal. I'm your guest host, Jennifer Delgado. Parenting doesn't come easy, especially when having a child with a disability. Autism is very hard for parents unaware of the disorder and for the child that cannot always communicate. Parents are finding it harder to obtain resources that can help them and their children. Joining us today is parent Lisa Quinones, and representing the Autism Society's Bronx chapter is Vice President Monica Sanabria and caseworker Margaret Finn. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now, what is autism, Monica? If you could just shed light on that for us.
Basically, it's a neurobiological disorder that affects the development of the child in a variety of domains, whether it's communication, socialization, so that you might have behavior management issues, you might have sensory issues, things might seem louder to them, or colors might be brighter, more intense than what a typically functioning child would experience.
Right. And now, Lisa, what are some of the signs that you saw in your own child?
When my son was about 18 months, I kind of had some suspicions that there may have been something wrong. He wasn't talking, he didn't really point, and I just felt something was off. So I went to my pediatrician, and I got the response, just, you know, boys are slower, wait until he's 2. And I waited until he was 2 and had him evaluated, and 3 months later he was diagnosed with autistic disorder and global developmental delay.
And are those the symptoms that you usually see when you're dealing with cases of autism?
Yes, usually there's delays in speech. You might have children who have very low affect. They're not very responsive emotionally. So a parent might try to be affectionate with the child. The child might withdraw, pull back, but that's because they may have a sensitivity to touch. That's why it's really important to kind of hone in on some of those sensory issues. So that's pretty typical.
Really? And how do you cope with having a child with autism?
It has been difficult, and it was especially difficult in the beginning for me and my husband, but we had a lot of early intervention services, and we really paired with all the therapists that came into our home, and we've just accepted it. We've made peace with it. We're able to see the growth that he has made in since his diagnosis, and we don't take a moment for granted. So everything, like every little milestone, is a big deal for us. I mean, if the first time he pointed his finger, we were all like jumping up and down and clapping. So it's we take every moment and we just celebrate it.
That's great. And now, Margaret, what have been your experiences with autism, and like what do you do, especially with the Bronx Society chapter?
In our program, Monica does the intake, and she assigns the cases to me that are more suited to my specialty with children.
Right.
So I basically deal with the family as a whole. We do an intake and find out what are the concerns of the parents, what are the concerns that they have for their child, either in academic or just linking them with the appropriate services. So I look at the whole family, the whole aspect of the child, and we work piece by piece, educational, and outside services in school, outside of school. So whatever the disability or whatever the issues, we try to address every single one of them for the family.
And what kind of schools do these, like if you have a kid with autism, can they attend regular school with this disability, or is there something?
Let me field that one.
Right.
There's a variety of types of schools. You have schools that are in community-based schools where it might be an autism program within a school. So you might have 6 students, 1 teacher, 2 paras. You also have private school settings for children who need something more restrictive. You also have collaborative team teaching where a child might be in a class of, let's say, 24, but may have push-in services like speech and language and such. So the idea is to make an assessment of the child, see what best meets his needs for learning, and then try to adapt the program to meet that.
Right. So what type of therapies are there for children with autism?
Basically, applied behavioral analysis, speech, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Those are the basics
Right.
for kids who have who are on the autism spectrum. They also have sensory gyms now. Some of the schools have those too, to work on those sensory issues. The sensory issues is something that they've been researching a little bit more,
Right.
because we're trying to find out what's causing the behavior. And a lot of times that can be tied to the sensory issue. So if there's a lot of noise in a classroom, the child might be striking and lashing out because it is so noisy.
Right.
So now we're kind of focusing, there's more research being done on sensory issues. So out of that, we're coming up with more therapeutic strategies to work on that.
And maybe, Lisa, you want to get on this too, but if you see someone that has, maybe like a friend that has a child, and they're showing these characteristics, how do you tell them diplomatically, you know, I think you might, you know, want to get this checked out?
That's something that I kind of try to stay away from unless the parent voices a concern.
Right.
I try to talk to them about what their child is doing, and I try not to bring it up. I don't want to be the one to say, oh, I think your child may have autism.
Right.
And,
It's touchy.
it's a touchy subject, and some parents aren't ready for it. So unless the parent expresses some kind of concern, then I wouldn't say anything.
Right. And since you have to work with these cases, how do you go about maybe mentioning how?
I mean, many of the families come in already with a diagnosis.
Okay.
But we do get parents who come in and they might say, oh, well, Johnny Jones isn't speaking yet, so I'm kind of concerned. So what I'll do, I have a brother who's on the autism spectrum, so I just think back to when he was a child, and I was like, well, does he do this, this, and this? Does he do this, this, and that? Does he kind of shy away when you try to hug him? And when I start talking about those little things, and then I give them a handout on what the symptoms are for autism, parent usually puts 2 to 2 together without me having to kind of push it on them.
Right.
And that will usually lead them to go see, you know, they'll ask me, well, should I get him tested? And see, as soon as I hear that, should I get him tested? Then we can say, oh, well, why don't you go see a neurologist, a psychologist? And from there, you know, it kind of gets them ready to at least explore this a little bit more.
Right. And how do you deal with parents that are in denial?
I mean, usually we've had some parents who were in denial, but once we started talking about it, I think when they hear it from someone else who's seen it and experienced it and worked with it, because when I start giving them some tips on how to work with those behavior management issues, they're like, well, wait a minute, maybe I should look into this a little bit more, because it'll make it easier for me to take care of the child in the home. And see, that's my selling point. The idea is to learn about the diagnosis, so this way you understand the child, so this way it'll be easier for you to care for the child. If you're thinking that, oh, it's going to go away, you'll see pretty quickly that it's not, or it'll worsen. So usually if they get a couple of tips, that'll bring them to a point where, well, maybe I should look at this a little bit more closely.
And Lisa, was it hard for you to find resources, or?
It was. When my son was diagnosed, I was kind of just handed this piece of paper and said, here you go, with some schools on it. And we had a caseworker working with us, but I found that a lot of the resources I found on my own, through the internet, through talking to other parents, and I always found that parents were always my best resource, because they were always the ones to say, well, I tried this, maybe you should try it too, maybe it works. So.
And now I hear that you are aspiring to maybe start your own school. You
Well,
have dreams of maybe wanting to start something that's more geared towards focusing on autism.
It's kind of on my to-do list, so to speak. I started a blog about a year ago called Autism Wonderland, kind of just chronicling our family journey with autism. It started as a class assignment. I'm in graduate school, so it started as a class assignment and it just kind of took off. So on my site I list resources and books and things that have kind of worked with us, resources especially here in the Bronx. And I guess in dealing with my frustration with the Board of Ed and seeing all the things that were lacking in the Bronx, I was talking to a friend who happens to be an ABA therapist, and she said, we should try to build our own school. And I said, well, if I could build my own school, it would have a sensory gym, and it would have, you know, psychologists and speech pathologists and everything that I know would work for a child like mine. And I said, yeah, let's try to do it. So we're still in the very early due diligence stage, trying to figure out what it would take to fund the school. And you know, I don't have a background in education. I'm just a mom. I work. I go to school.
That's
so.
how you just said.
But if I could comment, a lot of the really large agencies that work with kids with developmental disabilities were started by parents, and they started them to address the needs of their children and children that came along in the future. So it's a nice dream to have. And I've found that a lot of parents have been able to find, you know, through networking and such, they've been able to get their programs out there.
So I guess maybe this could go for all of you if you want to take turns on that, but how can people get more involved in the efforts towards autism? Like, how can we make a difference in that, or maybe just show a little more attention towards the subject?
I think that if you're a parent of a typical developing child, I think that you should try to educate your child on what autism is and what the signs are. Just today, I read an article about this little boy in London who hung himself for being bullied because he had autism. And I kind of think it starts at the home. I mean, I can try to raise awareness. We can all sit here and talk about autism awareness, but that's because we're all kind of in that moment. But I think at some point everyone needs to step up to the plate and kind of take responsibility and say, I need to learn I need to learn about autism. I mean, I didn't know about it until my son was diagnosed. And I find that that's that's the case with a lot of people. They don't know what autism is until it hits home. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about and taught to children at a very young age.
Well, we definitely learned so much today, and we thank you all for being here. Can we get some contact information, I guess? Where can we get contact with you?
Our agency is at North Central Bronx Hospital in the social work department at 3424 Kossuth Avenue. Okay. And the telephone number there is 718-519-4797.
And your blog?
AutismWonderland.com.
Thank you so much.